A pivot table is an interactive worksheet table that allows you to quickly analyze and summarize large amounts of data. Now here I don't have a large amount of data, but it's simple enough to work with. Make sure that when you're creating a pivot table that you have your database set up correctly. In other words, you can see over here I've got my row headers and my column headers, and it's all organized tight, and there's no gaps or spaces in between my rows or my columns. Go ahead and click anywhere within your database here, then come up on the Insert tab and go to your Tables group and click on the Pivot Table button, or click on its drop-down arrow to Pivot Table. It's going to confirm the selection here and say, look, is this your database? And I'm going to go ahead and say yes. Then it's going to ask you, where do you want to dump your pivot table on? A new worksheet or right in the same worksheet as your data? Well, I'm going to go ahead and say New Worksheet and click OK. So down here you can see I have sheet 6. It's on a new worksheet, and I can go back to my product sales where my data is sitting and know that my database is still here. In fact, when I go back to sheet 6, that's what this pivot table that I'm about to create is based upon that data. If I remove the data, then I don't have anything to base this pivot table upon. In fact, you can see over here you've got your field list, which lists all the column headers in January, February, March, April, May, and also the sales header as well. Over here I have the actual pivot table screen. Now if I click off of it, it gets rid of the field list because it assumes that I'm not working on a pivot table or I'm building one. So I'm going to go ahead and click back on the pivot table so I can get my field list and we can get started. A little bit more description here. In a pivot table you can specify which parts of the source data you'd like to interact with by choosing fields or items. First of all, fields are categories and items are subcategories. There are 4 types of fields. You have your page, row, column, and data. And all these fields are usually text, except the data field, which usually contains numbers. This is good to know when it comes to setting up your pivot table, because when we start checking these boxes here, it's going to find out whether or not that these boxes are text or numbers. And if it's text, it's more than likely going to drop it down as a row label or a column label. And if it's numbers, it'll dump them in the values. And you'll begin to see that your table will start taking shape here, or a Frankenstein as it were. A lot of people have asked me, well, how do I go ahead and set up the perfect pivot table? What do I need to know? There are 2 things. First of all, know your database. Go back to your product sales worksheet, know it. In other words, know the numbers, your column headers, and your row headers. And then back on your pivot table worksheet here, just know the basics that any fields that are text are usually going to be your labels for your rows or your columns, and any numbers or numerical values will be in your, well, values section here. We'll talk about the report filter later, but to get started, all I have to do is come up here and check one of the boxes. For example, sales. Once I check it, it adds it down below into the row labels section because it's text. For example, you can see over here there's row labels and there's the text. If I go back to my product sales, there's the header for all my rows, and all the row headers here are text. So let me go back to my pivot table worksheet and continue. Now one thing I want to explain about this is when you start checking these fields here, it'll go ahead and it'll start dropping them down into the corresponding sections like I just talked about, if they're numbers and the values, if they're text in the either as a column or row label. Sometimes this doesn't always work, and you want to be able to pull down into like the report filter section some of these fields here, which we'll talk about later. And what I mean by that is you can either check the boxes or you can actually click and drag them down in here into their sections, which I'm not going to do, so I'm going to go ahead and let go of that. But let's go ahead and check some more boxes. I also want to include in my pivot table, or data that I want to pivot or filter in and out, are my columns or my months, April, May, and June. And then as I check them off, it does 2 things. First of all, it adds them over here into the table, and then also dumps them down here. Now we have our labels for those columns. Those labels are text, which is April, May, and June. As you go back to our database here, again, it's text up here, isn't it? So it pulls those into the columns field. When I go back to my pivot table, here's the column labels, but then it has numbers below those column headers, our data, right? So it adds them down below here, the values. And as you can see here, I've got values for April, all the values here, values for May and June. Again, back to my database, there's the April numbers and also May and June. So you could say, well, why does it say some of April, some of May, or some of June? Well, what it does by default is it wants to give us a grand total. So when it says sum of April, these numbers aren't the sum, but when you add them all together, it gives us the sum down below. In fact, to verify this, when I select it, go down here on your status bar and you see where it says sum, 1675. There it is, 1675. So now I have some of the very simplistic, basic operations of my pivot table. I have a drop-down arrow. I can click on it and say for my row labels, I'm going to uncheck all of them and just say I want to see my fantasy for sales for April, May, and June, and click OK. So the totals for April, May, and June are 275 here, and that's all it shows. Couple of things that happen. First of all, you see that little funnel? That means that this field has been filtered. And if I want to get rid of it, then I want to click on the drop down arrow and clear the filter. And it gets rid of all of them. You notice how the field list disappeared? When it collapsed and it shrunk and it just showed the fantasy label here, my selection was outside of the pivot table, so the field list disappeared. So if it disappears, make sure you go back into the table here, the pivot table, so you can bring it back up. Now, if this was all that it could do, these pivot tables, just click on the drop-down arrow to filter out some of the fields here. You might say, well, it would be easier just to go back to simply applying a filter to my database. Well, it does a lot more. There's a lot of things you can do to customize your pivot table that makes it pretty fun and exciting, as well as very interactive. For example, I have my row labels here, and let's say I want to group them. In fact, if you look at this, I have my books, my fantasy book, fiction books, and self-help. And then I have my 3 MP3 downloads, or my music downloads for modern, new age, and pop. What I can do is I can group these together to make it a little bit more organized. To do so, I want to click on the fantasy first, hold down the control key, click on fiction, and then self-help so I can do multiple selections here. Let go of the control key, and then to group them, come up here to its related contextual tab, pivot tables here. We've got options and design. I'm going to go to the options tab, come here to the group, and then click on group selection. Automatically it groups the selection here and gives it a generic name, which I'll change in just a second, group 1. And then by default it groups the others by its own default name here. It just can't go ahead and just say I just want to group this. It actually wants to group all the rest, which is fine. I mean, I'll group these later, but for right now I don't want it to be called group 1. In fact, you see what happens when I click on it? You see the little pop-up there? It says sales to. Well, that's a label, isn't it? If I come down here into the rows label, it has sales to. Because the default sales labels are pulling in all these other labels down below, fiction, fantasy, self-help, and so forth. So when I created an additional label, it added it down here and called it a generic name sales 2 or sales label 2. So I'm going to come up here, click on it, come up to my formula bar, click and drag and delete it, and let's call it my books or for my group here. And then go ahead and click off in a blank area. It solidifies. Of course, my field list disappears. Let me click back on the pivot table. Now, if I want to make some additional changes before I group all the rest, for example, let's say I don't want to see my sales labels anymore. If I uncheck that, it gets rid of those sub-labels to my group here. Remember, fiction, fantasy, but it keeps the others, modern, new age, and pop. But no worries there. I mean, this just makes it easier for me to go ahead and select these 3 so I can group them. I'll come back to this and check my sales box after I group these 3. Again, up to the Options tab, to the Group Groups, and click on Group Selection. Click on here to select Group 2, and let's go ahead and name it my MP3s, and then hit Enter to accept it. Now if I want to go ahead and have those expandable buttons where I can see beneath each group title the actual labels for those groups for my books and also my MP3 downloads, come back here and just check Sales so it can add those labels. It expands. Of course, I can click on the minus sign to collapse it and click on it to expand it. Now, in addition to the row labels filter that you have here, where you can filter in and out these labels here, these records, you can also do a report filter. Like, for example, let's say if I want to do it just for the month of April, May, or June, I can say that those are also filters as well. To add them down here, you're going to have to click and drag, because when we checked it, Excel logically put them in their corresponding sections here for, of course, the column values, their labels, and then the actual numbers within the month here down in the values section. So I'm going to go ahead and click on April and then drag it down here and dump it. There's April, pulls up at the top. It gives me the filter option for my database here, or my pivot table. We also do May, June, and how about July? Click and drag and dump that down there. So I still have April, May, and June. And then if I didn't want July there, you noticed how it's checked. Just go ahead and uncheck that. It gets rid of it. So now I can go ahead and click on the drop down arrow and say for April, let me look at my sales that made $275 and click OK. So that was pop and fantasy. How do I know this? That it's reflecting the correct results. Let me go back to my database here in product sales. Come over to April, there's $275 for fantasy, and pop was also at $275 as well. All right, that's pretty cool. All right, back to the pivot table. I'm going to go ahead and click on the filter button here and choose all and click OK, so I'm back to normal. Now let's go ahead and customize our calculations. Again, the titles here for each column here is the sum of April, which means that it gives me all of April's totals here and gives me the sum down below. Now how about if I just want to get the average? Well, to do so, you want to come over here to your values section, and then you see where it says sum of April. Click on the arrow and go up to value field settings. Get a little pop-up up here and say I want it to be averaged. And then up here for the custom name, instead of the default average of April, I'm going to go ahead and delete it, and let's say it's the average, and then click OK. Automatically it changes the title here for this column for April, and it gives me the average. How do I know? Go ahead and click and drag and select the range, and you'll notice down the stat bar it's 279, and there it is, 279. Now if I need to go back and make changes to it, for example, I don't like the number format here, I want to use currency, just again come back, click on the drop down arrow to the value field settings, click on the number format button, choose currency, click OK, it updates it. Next I want to do some custom item calculations, or calculating the average of an item. For example, down here in my row labels I have sales, which is referring to my row headers here, but I also have sales 2, which is referring to my groups. So I'm going to go ahead and click on the drop down arrow for my sales 2, just my group names here for books and MP3s, go to field settings, and what I want to do is I want to select custom here on the subtotals and filters, and then say I want the average for these groups here, books and MP3s, and click OK. Now you can see here for my books I have the average in April is 275. Well, is that correct? Well, it is for this group. When I click and drag and select those 3 items in that group, you can see down here on the stat bar 275, there's 275 for that group, and then 133 for that group, and so on. So I can get totals here for each group, which is fun, not just the grand total for all the items here. Next I want to be able to remove the grand total here and maybe add some subtotals. To do so, all I have to do is come up here and click on the Design tab, come over here to the grand totals, click on the drop down arrow, and say I want it off for rows and columns. Click on that, it removes the grand total here. For my subtotals, click on the drop down arrow, and I want to be able to show all subtotals at the bottom of each group. Click on that, and it automatically adds my subtotals down below. So instead of my average being up here, it defines it a little bit better by putting it down here. So I have my books average, 275 for everything here. Of course, I can change that. If I don't want it to be average anymore, I can change it to summary and so forth just by, again, editing the field value here for my sales 2 groups. Next, let's go ahead and format the pivot table here. Come up to the Design tab, go to the Pivot Table Styles group, and click on the More button. Let's come down here, not something that's so light, but maybe a little bit more medium, or you could go dark, but that's too dark for me. And if you look over here, do you see this style here? It's got the column headers up at the top, and then it looks like shaded in the subtotals there. So I'm going to go ahead and click on that to see what it looks like. So it's a little bit dark, but that's okay. And it also gave me contrasting colors against a dark background, so now my text turned to white, or at least my labels here. We'll go ahead and leave it like that. But it looks good because I have my contrasting colors here for my subtotals, and that looks nice. And then also for my groups here. And then of course you have additional features here up on the Design tab, your pivot table style options for your banded rows. So it went ahead and it banded my rows, so it gives me a straight line to look for. And also banded columns if I want to go ahead and create borders for my columns here. And before we do our final feature here, learning how to set this up to print off, is that again I want to remind you when it comes to building your pivot tables, keep in mind the 2 basics. First of all, be sure you know your database and it's set up correctly. You have your row labels and your column labels. Second of all, know that when you're creating your pivot table that it's going to look for your values, numbers within your database here, your main section here, right here, and it's going to dump them in the values section or over here in the main part of your pivot table, and then any text it'll put as a row label or a column label accordingly. Now let's go ahead and set this up so we can print it off. I'm going to come up here and click on the Design tab, come down here to my layout group and click on the blank rows button, and I want to insert a blank line after each item. Click on that. You can see after each item it gives me a little bit of spacing here so it's not all jumbled together, so the groups look a little bit more broken up here. Now, I don't want my report filters up at the top. I don't need that, especially when it comes to printing this off. So I'm going to come over here to the report filter group, click on the drop down arrow, and remove each field here, May and June, so they're not listed up here. Then come back up here, click on the Options tab, and when it comes to printing this off, they don't need the field headers. They don't need to know that these are the row labels. So I'm going to come over here to the Show Hide and click on field headers to remove them. That way it looks a little bit more simplistic. And then to see what I get before I print it off, remember to go to your Print Preview. Click on the Office logo button, come down to Print, and Print Preview. Click on the page to zoom in, and what you see is what you get. Hey, thanks for watching. If you like my video, please give it a thumbs up. And if you subscribe to my YouTube channel, as soon as I upload a new video, you'll be notified instantly, and you can do that by coming over here and clicking on my face. You can also click here to support me, so for $2 a month, you can have access to over 2,700 training videos, all ad-free, and for a few bucks more, you can have access to my exercises, instructor notes, quizzes, certificate of completion, and a whole lot more.